In this series, you'll learn a detailed history of the rise and fall of gaming companies. So, to catch future episodes, make sure you hit that sub button. And now, it's time for the rise and fall of Pandemic Studios, the game developer responsible for Star Wars Battlefront, Mercenaries, Full Spectrum, and Destroy All Humans. In 1998, Pandemic Studios was formed as an equity investment from Activision in hopes that the developer would be fruitful for the publisher. At the head of Pandemic Studios were two former Activision employees, Josh Resnick and Andrew Goldman. The duo went right to work creating sequels on two previous Activision games. Battlezone 2 Combat Commander was released in 1999. The game's story focuses on a conflict during an alternative 1990s period in which humanity explores space for resources only to encounter an alien race. This leads to a conflict and they become locked in combat. When the game was released, it was extremely buggy and required top-end computers to run the game. After a patch was released, the game received a lot of positive attention, with critics and gamers both praising the game. In 2000, Pandemic Studios completed the second sequel that they were working on with Dark Reign 2. The game focused on multiplayer, allowing up to 32 players at once to play, and encouraged gamers to use custom mods that came with the game files. Dark Reign 2 was a commercial failure, however, and it failed to even hit the sales charts for PC. Following the release of Dark Reign 2, some of the members of Pandemic Studios left Los Angeles office and formed a satellite office in Brisbane, Australia. The team began to work on a new game titled Army Men RTS, while the Los Angeles team developed Triple Play 2002. Released in 2002, Triple Play received mixed reviews. It looked great, but lacked all the polish of other baseball games released at that time. Army Men RTS was also released in 2002 and, like Triple Play, was met with mixed reviews. Based in the Army Men universe, this real-time strategy game had players fighting for resources to build their armies, but gamers were frustrated by how easy the game was. Pandemic Studios saw their first successful release when it teamed up with LucasArts to create Star Wars: The Clone Wars that was also released in 2002. This was a critical game for the developer, who would continue to work on Star Wars titles after the success. Set in the prequel era of Star Wars, The Clone Wars is split up into two segments: vehicles and third-person Jedi fighting. The single-player campaign is played from the perspective of Jedi Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Mace Windu, and all of them are able to pilot vehicles and ride animal mounts. With the shift away from real-time strategy games and the success of the Clone Wars, Pandemic Studios began to focus on third-person shooters. Released in 2004, Pandemic Studios developed Full Spectrum Warrior as a mix between real-time tactics and third-person shooting. But the development of this game went way beyond the basic concept and began around the year 2000. In 2000, the U.S. Army's science and technology community was curious to learn if commercial gaming platforms could be leveraged for training. Recognizing that a high percentage of incoming recruits had grown up using entertainment software products, there was an interest in determining whether software game techniques and technology could complement and enhance established training methods. The most radical decision in the game's development was to limit the first-person actions to issuing orders and directions to virtual fire teams and squad members. The implementation defined conventional wisdom, winning both awards and commercial acceptance. The game's working title evolved from C-Force to ultimately Full Spectrum Warrior. It sold over 1 million copies alone for the Xbox and PC, with the PlayStation version being released a year later. Both critics and gamers praised Full Spectrum Warrior as an excellent game that separated itself from other military shooters. Success was starting to pile up for Pandemic Studios. It came to a peak with the release of Star Wars Battlefront in 2004. Released alongside the DVD collection of the original trilogy, which was a genius marketing tactic in my opinion, Star Wars Battlefront allowed gamers to relive the legendary battles from the original trilogy. Gamers finally were able to experience massive Star Wars battles in iconic locations as over 4 million copies were sold. Multiplayer was a huge emphasis, but Battlefront lacked on the single-player campaign. Ultimately, gamers and critics both loved the experience and was the foundation for much more to come from Pandemic Studios. The mid-2000s was a huge development period for Pandemic Studios as it released the first entries into the Battlefront and Full Spectrum series. In 2005, the success continued with the release of Mercanies: Playground of Destruction. The game features an open-world environment with elements of potential stealth gaming and reputation-based social mechanics and is set during a fictitious multinational military action in North Korea. The player gains control of one of 3 mercenary main characters and completes contracts in the war-torn country for profit and to prevent a nuclear war. Critics praised the gorgeous graphics, voice acting, and said the game was fundamentally satisfying. Mercenaries was another successful game, both financially and critically, for Pandemic Studios. Pandemic Studios has a knack for excellent third-person action and destruction mechanics. With the success of Mercenaries, Pandemic went on to develop Destroy All Humans in 2005. Set in 1959 in the United States and parodies the lifestyles, pop culture, and political attitudes of this time period, Destroy All Humans was filled with plenty of humor and anal probing. Destroy All Humans was a success, selling over 1 million copies within the first year. Gamers enjoyed the adult humor, destructible environments, and the similar gameplay of Grand Theft Auto, but with aliens. Full Spectrum, Star Wars Battlefront, Mercenaries, and Destroy All Humans had established Pandemic Studios as a successful and financially stable developer that could produce quality games that result in profit. With those 4 games established, Pandemic Studios got to work on follow-up sequels for all 4 games. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was released in 2006. The game features new vehicles, characters, game mechanics, maps, and missions compared to the original Battlefront. Unlike its predecessor, Battlefront 2 features a more narrative-based campaign, retelling portions of the Star Wars story from the point of view of a veteran clone Imperial Stormtrooper, reminiscing about his tour of duty in service of both the Galactic Republic and the Galactic Empire. Gameplay additions over Battlefront include the use of Jedi and Sith, additional game modes such as Hero Assault, and objective-based space battles. Battlefront 2 was a smash hit, selling over 6 million copies worldwide, with critics praising most aspects of the game. But the other sequels would not be as successful. Full Spectrum 10 Hammers was released in 2006. New gameplay mechanics such as splitting up fire teams into groups of 2 were added. The player was also given the ability to position firearms differently in interiors that help negate the enemy's cover. The game also changed up the multiplayer mode. In multiplayer, players can recruit civilians, capture safe houses for reinforcements, and field medics. Each fireteam member also had a special attribute. Full Spectrum 10 Hammers received mixed reviews and was seen as a commercial failure as it didn't sell as well as the first title. Destroy All Humans 2 was also released in 2006, but fared better than Full Spectrum. Critics commented on the new weapons and body snatching ability that added more fun and noted that the game had a huge open world with plenty of side missions. The humor was still intact as players invaded the year of 1969 with a plot revolving around the KGB. But some critics commented on how stupid the citizens actually were, stating that they already acted brain dead. Despite the small criticisms, the game reportedly sold over 340,000 copies and had a generated revenue of $13 million in North America alone. The final of the 4 sequels was Mercenaries 2, released in 2008. To counter the dark and gloomy atmosphere of the first game, the developing artists wanted to create a colorful environment and were immediately attracted to somewhere with more colorful scenery, which led the game to be set in Venezuela, where communism was ruining the country that led to much conflict that could be implemented into Mercenaries 2. Mercenaries 2 went through many development struggles and was notorious for its constantly changing release date. Its original launch date was December 2006, before being pushed back to spring 2007, winter 2007, spring 2008, summer 2008, and then to its final release date of September 2008. The constant pushback resulted in a preset negative viewpoint from the fanbase. Some members of Pandemic Studios have now stated that the game was rushed too quickly and was released unfinished due to the pressure from EA. But EA wasn't finished with their hand in Mercenaries 2. Marketing stunts from EA also resulted in criticism. EA took over a petrol station in Finsbury Park, North London on the release day of Mercenaries 2 with the idea of giving away 20,000 euros of petrol for free, with each driver receiving a maximum of 40 euros. The petrol station was transformed into a military bunker with sandbags, oil barrels, and jeeps. The marketing effort created a huge traffic congestion, with many businesses and local parliament members becoming upset. Mercenaries 2 continued the trend of sequels not being met with as much praise as their predecessors for Pandemic Studios. It received mixed reviews, with critics stating that the game felt unfinished and was filled with stupid NPCs, both friendly and for enemies. The Venezuelan government criticized the game as American propaganda that may lead to an American military invasion. While comical, it was still another issue that Pandemic Studios PR had to issue a statement on. While Mercenaries 2 was a big misstep for Pandemic Studios, there were other forces that were cause for concern. In January 2008, VG Holding Company, that had purchased Pandemic Studios a few years prior, was being purchased by Electronic Arts, which for many game developers became the kiss of death. Hoping to stop the bleeding from the lukewarm receptions of the previous 3 games, Pandemic Studios released The Lord of the Rings: Conquest in 2009. Borrowing many elements from the highly successful Battlefront games, Conquest focused on inspiration that was cut from the films and incorporated more lore from the novel series. Allowing players to play as both forces of good and evil, critics stated that the game nailed all the small details with the score, voice acting, and setting, but it lacked the substance and that the single-player campaign was brief. Lord of the Rings: Conquest saw mixed reviews, with most being negative, and was again another misstep for Pandemic Studios. The end was coming for Pandemic Studios. EA shut down the Brisbane location in February of 2009, while the rest of the studio worked on what would become Pandemic's final game, The Saboteur. EA was also struggling during this time and made the decision to cut over 1,500 jobs from their own studios. Because of that decision, Pandemic was on the chopping block, with close to 230 employees being released from the studio. The remaining 35 were absorbed by EA and were set to close out the Saboteur project. Released in December of 2009, The Saboteur was an action-adventure game combining driving, shooting, melee combat, and exploration. The game is set in Nazi-occupied France as the player controls Sean, a man with a lengthy criminal past who fled Ireland to escape his history. Sean becomes entwined with the French resistance and begins liberating portions of Paris and France by completing missions and jobs. While it was praised for its visuals, sound design, setting, amount of content, and entertaining gameplay, many criticized its repetitiveness, the storyline's execution, various technical issues, and the general lack of polish. But it was received much better than the last few games from Pandemic. Unfortunately, because of EA shutting down Pandemic Studios, some of the developed content and ideas were cut from the final version of the game. Still, The Saboteur was a respectable release from Pandemic that sent the studio out on a positive note. With The Saboteur being released, EA shut down Pandemic Studios for good. The final employees of Pandemic Studios released an Office Space-style spoof of them destroying office equipment in response to the studio closing. So that was the rise and fall of Pandemic Studios, the developer behind Star Wars Battlefront, Mercenaries, Destroy All Humans, and Full Spectrum. The sequels to these games proved to be the downfall of Pandemic Studios. While Star Wars Battlefront 2 did exceptionally well, the rest of the sequels did not meet expectations and resulted in EA closing down the developer. What's your favorite game by Pandemic Studios, and do you think EA made the right decision in shutting down the developer? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like this channel and subscribe to watch more episodes of the rise and fall of gaming companies. Thanks for watching.